The idea is to leave here with something from the Lord. And when you have it, say amen. Acts 18, verses 1 through 17. If you can't find it, you're not familiar with your Bible, somebody next to you will help you find it. Meanwhile, it's up on the screen. Luke writes in the 18th chapter of Acts the following. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians hearing Paul believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you. And no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people." And he stayed 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or a vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." And he drove them from the tribunal, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. This is the word of the Lord. I want to join with you today in finding in the scriptures here today, in particular, finding Jesus. We've been going through these narratives, these events, the wild and woolly adventures of the Apostle Paul as he goes out preaching, and sometimes it might seem like we're focusing on Paul because Luke is giving us such a detailed kind of a log of Paul's adventures in preaching the gospel. But make no mistake, what we're seeing in the book of Acts is nothing but Christ at work through his people. And today we see Jesus Christ and aspects of Jesus Christ that I think will be of great motivation to a lot of us and of great comfort to a lot of us, as well as we see two aspects, very different but not contradictory in any way, very parallel, very, very complementary to one another. And that is that Jesus is relentless. Jesus Christ is absolutely and totally relentless when it comes to gospel work. And I think that has to be said from time to time because sometimes we tend to get a little bit delicate when it comes to gospel work. And we tend to think that we should allow ourselves certain amounts of fragility and self-pity even when it comes to God's work, that we're going to see that Jesus Christ has no part in, and he is relentless. His kingdom will expand. He will build his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The kingdom will go forth, the gospel will go forth. His plans decreed from eternity past will come to be exactly as he said. He's relentless. Know this. He's relentless. But the same Jesus Christ that is relentless and does not entertain excuses or reasons for the gospel not going forward, he is also a refresher and a companion to those who serve him in gospel work. He's relentless. The gospel must go forth. But those that he is using to move the gospel forth with, those that he is doing this through, he has care for them. And we're going to see how this works out in the life of Paul as we go through this. See, because if you've been with us for any amount of time and you've been tracking with how we're laying out these episodes, how Luke chooses to, with all that's going on in the gospel, he focuses on Paul and his adventures. And now on this second missionary journey, we're seeing all of these places that he goes and all of these different cities that he goes to. And you almost begin to feel a rhythm to it. There's almost a pattern to it, right? It kind of goes something like, land on a new shore, go to the synagogue, because most cities did have one, and preach the gospel, be rejected, go to the Gentiles, angry mob followed by violence or threats of violence, and then some midnight sneak out of the town to get on a boat and go to the next town. It just kind of repeats itself. And we just kind of saw it over and over again in Lystra, Philippi, Thessalonica, Athens, Berea. We see this pattern beginning. And as we come to this new section, and we see today we're going to be in Acts 18, and we're going to be in the city of Corinth. We're just about ready to just, you know how very few movies have a unique and just some new plot line to them? I mean, there's very little originality. I mean, you watch movies and it's kind of same junk, different faces, same junk. Maybe a different explosion here, but it's the same kind of, and we almost feel like, so this that we've been seeing in Paul's life with very few variations, this is just the same thing over and over again. It could bore some of us. It could dissuade some of us and say, hey, I'm glad I don't have anything to do with the gospel. It could make some of us say, you see, that's why I'm frustrated and tired, because gospel work is hard and it's just doesn't have a whole lot of hope and comfort in it. But if we look closely in this, we're going to see some aspects, again, of Jesus Christ, not so much of Paul, but of Jesus Christ that I hope will be of tremendous motivation and healing, I think, to some of us. We've seen as we've gone through this book of Acts, as we said, these are not the Acts of Paul, and they're not even the Acts of the church. And I think they're mislabeled in many of our Bibles where it says it's the Acts of the Apostles. Not initially, they're not. These are the acts of the risen Jesus Christ by his Spirit through his church. This is Jesus working, and that's why we say these are works that are to be continued. We are the continuation of this. And so it's important that we know what gospel work looks like in its glorious moments, in those moments of great victory, in those moments of heartache and hardship and of darkness and of depression. Because that comes too. And so, I mean, all you have to do is look at the story and that, again, that repeating pattern in the life of Paul, and you can almost feel the fatigue of Paul and company by now. Anybody ever been on a prolonged trip? And ever been on a trip that is longer than you intended? I remember going to South America, and we expected to stay there just a certain amount of days, and one of the pastors I'm with winds up in the hospital in South America, and this trip just gets prolonged, and it just gets scary, and it gets uncertain, and it looks nothing like the itinerary, and nothing like my plans, and everybody was expecting me back by this day, and I had everything late, and it's just, and these guys, that was pretty much their life. They probably stopped writing itineraries anymore. It was just this constant fluidity. Everything was so dynamic, just constantly changing. They didn't know which city they were going to be at. They didn't know when they were going to get there, when they were going to leave. But sometimes it seemed like all that was being determined by angry mobs and jealous Jews. And it just seemed like, my God, it just seems like all we do is get kicked around by everyone else. And you can almost begin to feel the fatigue of these guys. Timothy, Silas, Luke, Paul. Remember how they left? Remember when they left? When they left the shores of their land to go off on the second journey, and everybody was excited, and he takes Silas with him, and they find Timothy, come on, we're going to preach, and everybody's excited. But after just so many beatings and nights in jail and midnight runs to the boat to get out of town, it could begin to wear on you. And I'm sure it wore on them, and I'm sure because it shows up in the scriptures, as we'll see here in a moment. But don't miss as we go through this. Don't miss these aspects of Jesus. He's relentless when it comes to gospel work, but he's refreshing to those through whom he works. And as we get to verse 1, we see that this begins to unfold for us. In verse 1, it says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. After this, and you recall after that, this was what we looked at last week, that they go to Athens and he meets with the great thinkers of the day and the cultural center of the known world at the time. And he brilliantly stands for the gospel, and he brilliantly uses their own poets to lead them to a place of being open to the gospel. But when it was all said and done, there just seems to be something unfinished. There's been times where Marlene and I have gone to a restaurant that's just too fancy, just not us. And sometimes they'll serve something up, this whole nouveau cuisine where it's like 2 sticks and a leaf stuck into like a tablespoon of some mush, and there's your entree. And it costs more than you normally spend on groceries for the month, and you eat it, and you're still hungry. I mean, you're driving home from a $100 dinner thinking, I'm gonna go home and pour me some cereal, because it just kind of leaves you all that. I showered. I mean, we went to dinner, and I'm coming home hungry from dinner just after all that. And Paul goes to Athens, and you remember how his heart was provoked within him, and he saw the idolatry and said, I have the answer to everything you're looking for in all of those false gods, and his name is Jesus. And he goes and he preaches. But when it's all said and done and he leaves Athens, it doesn't speak of great multitudes there. We don't hear about the huge, roaring, multiplying, massive mega church that is left in Athens. We hear of a few converts. We see kind of an overwhelming indifference from the people. And see, Paul had tasted both, and that's what ministry is like. Ministry is some days you'll see God move gloriously in a big way. You'll see mass conversions and healings and God doing great things and people winning souls and people are on fire for Jesus. And it's exciting, but that in itself, it brings its own wear and tear. And then there's the other side of ministry that we see Paul tasting, where you preach your guts out, you risk your neck, and people are indifferent. And that wears on your heart too. And some of you have tasted some of that when you're sharing the gospel with somebody and they don't receive. And they're too proud, too busy, you got too many other plans. They're smarter than all that. Or when you're even preaching to believers, telling them to grow and to engage and to get on mission and to do the things that God has called us to do and to be sanctified. And they don't change, and there's just another Sunday, it's another Bible study, it's another cup of coffee. And that can wear on you too. So after that strange situation, beatings, jail, mobs, indifference, Paul leaves Athens and he comes to Corinth. And you got to understand, at the time that Luke wrote Acts, and this letter is circulating, part of a 2-volume work with the Gospel according to Luke and the book of Acts, that as soon as that word, and for the reader of that day, when they read that, and Paul went to Corinth, there was a reaction in them that is lost on us. We don't have that same reaction. We don't feel what they felt when they read Corinth, because when they read Corinth, that meant a lot, and it wasn't good. See, because just like Athens was renowned for being this brain center, this center of academia and philosophy, it was this great place of just intellectualism, and people would come and share ideas, and it was this marketplace of the mind kind of a place. Well, as they were famous for that, Corinth was also renowned, maybe even more so, but not for that. They were renowned for being completely and utterly perverse. It was a place of complete and utter immorality. Matter of fact, in the ancient world, to say that someone committed sexual immorality, you would say they Corinthianized. Corinth had become so synonymous with this kind of foulness, this kind of licentious living, just doing, and whatever feels right, go for it. That's where he went. And that's going to be important when we see Paul's reactions and Paul's feelings, and how Paul, being as weary as he was when he came into a city like that, why he felt what he felt. But nonetheless, verse 1 says that that's where he went. And already you can see something there that Paul could have said when the captain says, we've pulled up ashore, we've pulled up to the dock, everybody disembark now, we're now in Corinth. He says, oh no, I just can't. I just don't have it in me. I just came from a dark place, and this place is darker. And I don't even have my boys with me. Timothy and Silas have not even come yet, and I've got to come and stand alone in all this darkness. I just don't have it anymore. But no, Paul got there. Probably scraped the bottom of the barrel of motivation, just all he could get. And he got off the boat. And he sees what everyone had said about Corinth is true. See, Corinth sits on this real thin isthmus, this real narrow piece of land, so that it has two major ports into two different seas. And so they got sailors coming from two different directions. And people would come into this city, and under the cover of anonymity, like so many business hubs in America today, you travel through parts of Asia, you'd swear you're walking through hell. You go through Bangkok, where the sex trade is the number one producer of income. And somehow, most Western businessmen, mostly American, find some reason to route their flights through Bangkok. And under the cover of anonymity, all kinds of slavery and trading of young children goes on. This kind of stuff was going on in Corinth as well. Sailors would come from everywhere. And what happened in Corinth stayed in Corinth. And they would have their fill of that sin and then go on their way. And Corinth was more than happy to accommodate them. And here's Paul. A little soul weary, in love with Jesus in a city where nobody loves him. And he just looks at the task at hand and just wonders whether he has what it takes to even engage them. Just on the outskirts of the city was a high hill, and sitting on top of it was a temple to the goddess Aphrodite. And it said that at night, 1,000 slaves from that temple would wander the streets at night, working their trade of prostitution. And somehow that was some kind of worship to the goddess Aphrodite. This was just the way things were done. It was just dark. It was just horrible. Even other pagan cities considered it pagan. Even other immoral cities called it immoral and would avoid it. It was not the place where you took the family on vacation. And the Apostle Paul lands there, but God in all his grace and all his mercy and all his providence, because of Paul's earlier work, though it cost him blood and jail time and hatred and being cursed and chased out of town, somehow it had borne fruit that had come along to wait for him there. It says, because when he got there, verse 2, he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them because he was of the same trade. He stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. To see the hand of God in this, would you? Paul had already gone and preached, and the gospel had begun to creep from all of these great metropolises where he had been. And the gospel goes, and the gospel had reached places, and we don't know exactly how or when it was that Priscilla and Aquila had heard the gospel, but they heard the gospel and they were saved, and they were at that point residing in Rome. And just as Paul is making his trip to come around and land in Corinth, it occurs to Claudius to say, I'm tired of hearing about all of the controversy and the upheaval caused by the preaching of, and even secular historians say that they were tired of all the talk about this Christos. They didn't even get his name right, Christ. Everybody's talking about Jesus. And it was just causing so much upheaval in Rome that there's this decree made, get all these believing Jews out of here. So when he references the Jews, he's talking about those who believed in Christ. And he kicks all those Christians out, all those who believed in Christ. Well, that only served to further the gospel as he keeps sprinkling them and spreading them to different cities and different places. Thinking he's stamping them out, he's just spreading the fire. And here come Aquila and Priscilla, and they come just at the right time to land there just before Paul arrives in Corinth, so that when Paul finds himself in his dark place, feeling lonely as could be, he meets a young couple who's deeply in love with Jesus. I don't know how many of you have been far away from home, all alone. Man, you meet somebody else who loves Jesus and you don't want to let them go. I remember after a really long trip, I was sitting in an airport in Hong Kong, and I was just spent. I was just spent physically, emotionally. I was missing my family like crazy. I was missing my church like crazy. I was sick and tired of airports. I suffered from severe motion sickness. I was inside out from having been on planes for 20-some hours. And I'm sitting there in the airport, and some young Brit comes and sits next to me, and he pulls out a book. I don't remember if it was C.S. Lewis or somebody. And I said, "Oh, thank you, Jesus." And we began to talk about Jesus. And it was just what I needed, just to get me home. Now here's Paul in Corinth, and he runs into, and not just a Christian. I don't think you have to be a pastor to appreciate this, but Paul had been trying to spread the gospel, that the gospel would not just save individuals, but that the gospel would begin to infiltrate culture, that entire families would know Jesus. And that's how God worked in his ministry. You saw over and over again with the Philippian jailer, with Cornelius, that entire families are coming to Jesus. And it's so beautiful to see in a pagan world when entire families are coming and serving Jesus together. And when he comes there, he meets a couple. And I know I speak for the elders here and some who have pastored. Isn't it a beautiful thing to see a man and a woman married and equally sold out for the cause of Christ? Oh, it's a beautiful thing. It's an encouraging thing. It's something that moves the heart of a leader deeply to see, oh, look at what you're doing, Lord. There is no limits on what this couple can do, what you can do through them. It's not one dragging the other or the other, one pushing the other. No, they both love Jesus, and he meets this couple, and just by chance, see the providence of God. Not only does he meet him and they love his Jesus, that would have been enough. But Paul got there, and Paul got there unemployed. There were no Christians there to meet him with big baskets of food and an apartment. You know how I was talking to a pastor couple a couple of years ago and was a little bit befuddled. And they were 2 or 3 years into their ministry in a new city and still had not gotten over the complaint that the church didn't hire a good enough interior decorator for their new place when they got there. I know Paul arrived there, and he was just so happy to see somebody else who loved Jesus. But as it so happened, they were tent makers of all trades. See, it was mandatory that every young aspiring Pharisee learn a trade. You had to know how to do something. And somehow, way back when, in the heart of a young, passionate Saul of Tarsus, the Lord moves his heart to choose tent making. Very practical skill in those days. Most things were made of these big leather tents. Everything was done that way. It was like learning construction. And so here's a good trade for him to know, not knowing that all these years later, God had already worked in the hearts of another couple to be of this same trade, so that he brings them together in this town, in this place, at this moment, when Paul needed to be able to bankroll gospel work in that city. And here he comes and he finds work with them. Spiritual refreshment and employment. Because sometimes this is necessary. I remember when we first planted the church and working all kinds of different jobs to help subsidize the rent for the church. And I mean, every little thing. You feel every little thing. The drummer needs new drumsticks. Oh my God, where are we going to get money for the drumsticks? Every little thing comes home to you because there's no fund, there's no outside support, and just God in his faithfulness, just like this. I remember times where I would tell my, I don't even know how we're going to get groceries, much less pay the rent for the church. And a contract would fall out from apparently heaven and be enough to cover our bills, the bills of the church, and enough to give to missions. We started giving to missions before we even had we were renting everything we had. And here comes Paul, and he's able to work this job. And it shows that the gospel's worth that. The gospel is worth pulling double duty. He didn't say, I'm going to wait until we get a nice pot of money and get all of our supporters in order. And no. Because why? Because my commander is relentless, and the gospel has to keep going every single day, every single moment. There's not a season of leisure in gospel work. It never stops. He's relentless. I was talking to a couple of pastor friends of mine, and it was funny. It was something that we all, I think, thought was kind of peculiar to each one of us, but as it turns out, it's just kind of the way it goes. We were talking about going on vacations, and I was telling them, I hate packing. I just hate packing. I hate it. I just hate it. And then you add 3 kids to it, and I really hate it. Chloe needs a bigger bag than I do. It's just bags and bags and bags, and I hate it. Marlene knows I hate it. And we were talking about how much we hated packing for trips. And then it came up with 1 of us, 2 of us, 3 of us, and ultimately like about 5 or 6 of us. Yeah. And then we got to take all these books. Oh, you take books too? Yeah. I thought you're not supposed to take books on a vacation. I was feeling guilty because I take books on vacation to study. And no, man, I have to. Why? I start going crazy. I got to get off and pray. But hey, answer me this. You ever preach on a vacation? Yeah, the confessions of pastors when we get together. Because you know what? You can't turn it off. It doesn't go away. You don't take vacations from God. The gospel cause is relentless. It has to go forward always, at all times. For those of you who are waiting for a more commodious time, a more accommodating season of your life, for this difficult season to pass, I'm telling you, God is relentless. Paul said, if I have to work, I'll work. And every Sabbath he would spend it in the synagogue. And every day in the streets that he could find people, every time that he was not making a tent, and probably while he was making a tent, he was telling people about Jesus. We see that this couple, and we're going to see more of them later as we read the epistles and even later in the book of Acts, but just so you see how dear this couple was and how much they were in God's plan, that he puts them there to be of support to Paul and to the gospel work in this place. Paul writes of them in Romans 16. You don't have to turn there, just listen. When Paul writes to the Romans church, he says, apparently that edict from Claudius didn't last too long, or wasn't obeyed very long, because we find that Priscilla and Aquila make their way back to Rome. And when Paul writes to Rome, he says, greet Prisca, which is short for Priscilla, and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. Greet also the church in their house. It just didn't change. All that time had passed and they were still on fire for Jesus. All that time had passed and they even housed a church in their home. They were sold out. I would love to have more Aquilas and Priscillas. More families, more couples completely and utterly given to the cause of Christ. And he holds them so, so dear because of the way God had used them. And it says here what his schedule was like during this time. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. See that every Sabbath, because God is relentless. He didn't say, as soon as my boys get here, I'm going to get back to preaching. No, they weren't even there yet, but he had to keep preaching. Why? This is urgent. Souls die every day. In the time that we've been sitting here wondering whether or not we liked this sermon or not, hundreds, if not thousands of souls have been thrust into eternity. This matters a lot. And his buddies finally come. You remember back in chapter 17, before he left, and he's shipped off to Athens, the guy who escorts him out to the boat, he turns to him, he says, yeah, I'm going to get on the boat and I'm going to go to Athens and thank you. But you turn around and you immediately go back and you tell Timothy and Silas to meet me as soon as possible. I'm not wanting to do this by myself. Well, here he is 2 cities later, and God knows how much longer, because travel was not quick. And finally his buddies join him. And when they join him, they are more proof further proof that while God is relentless, he is also a God of comfort. He brought him already Aquila and Priscilla. He gave him a job to subsidize the work. But he also brings him great gifts when he brings him his friends. They were of great refreshment to Paul. Some faces. I remember the first time, I always made it a point, the first 4 or 5 times I went to Asia to make sure that I never went by myself. And I have a couple buddies here in the States, and I'd push and prod them to set up their flights so that I could meet with them when we fly out of San Francisco or LA or something together. I don't want to leave U.S. soil alone. I don't want to land somewhere strange. I'm not going to go through Taiwan all by myself. I'm not going to land in Delhi instead. You can't even imagine what the airport in Delhi is like. It's just an ocean of people. And by myself, don't speak. I'm not doing it, man. And I was able to pull that off for the first 4 or 5 times. And then one time, nothing worked. Nobody could move their itinerary around. And I had to go by myself all the way. And in order to save money, you understand, you take some really weird flights. I end up going through all kinds of weird places, and finally I get to where I'm going. And I'll tell you, when you see a face you know, I remember just through this ocean of people that I just, all of a sudden, one familiar face, didn't even remember brother's name. I just remember I'd seen him a couple years ago in India. He comes running up, and he's probably wondering, why is this guy hugging me so much? We don't do this in India. This is not how we roll. And so when I was done hugging him, I just latched onto him and followed him around. And here's Paul in his dark city, and here comes 2 familiar faces. Not just familiar, but dear faces. Timothy, who had given himself to the work. Silas, who was well known for his passion and his service. And he says, oh, guys, it's so good to see you. So God is relentless and refreshing at the same time, but there's more to it. They were not just friends from a faraway land, but they bore glad tidings. They brought him good news about the church that had been established in Thessalonica. And I'll tell you, there are days in ministry where you just need some good news. You just need to know that somebody got saved. You just need to know that somebody quit a habit that was dragging them down. You just need to know that 2 people reconciled. You just need it. And here's Paul, pretty weary, and he gets word from them that things in Thessalonica were looking good. And he writes about it when he writes to the Thessalonians, and he says, but now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us the good news of your faith and love, and reported that you always remember us kindly and long to see us as we long to see you for this season, brothers. In all our distress and affliction, we have been comforted about you through your faith. For now we live if you are standing fast in the Lord. Oh, it's so good to know things are going well in Thessalonica. All right, I'm feeling it now. I got Priscilla and Aquila. I've got Timothy and Silas. I'm getting good news about our past work. All of a sudden, in the middle of this darkness, I'm feeling like yeah, I was tired, but I'm feeling refreshed. The same God who's pushing me on is also comforting me along the way. And furthermore, they brought financial support. They brought a gift from the church in Philippi, from the churches in Macedonia. And that's why Paul is able to say that he now had given himself to the preaching of the gospel. He didn't have to make tents anymore because this work came. And that's why I tell you, and that's why we encourage you, and that's why God has blessed us and helped us to be able to do this, because it's so important to be able to help other gospel workers so that they can dedicate themselves to that. Just like what you're doing in helping plant these churches in India. That these men not have to preach 15 minutes on the bus on the way to work and 15 minutes on the bus after work for the rest of their lives. But to be able to give their days, the better part of their lives, to the preaching of the gospel, the raising up of disciples. How do they do that? When we free them up from that need to work those other jobs, by sending them, by helping them so that they can go to school on a scholarship and be prepared for ministry and jump right into it, so that they don't have to take a 1-year program and stretch it over 4 years because they can only take 1 class at a time. You bless the gospel work. You accelerate the work when you give to support those things. I remember the day I was able to walk into my manager's office and serve notice and say, I'm not going to work here anymore. And she looked at me and she said, Erik, what are you going to do? You're going to work just for the church? I said, by God's grace, somehow we're going to make it. Can they pay you what we're paying you? I said, not even close. I said, but it's time now. And she said to me, well, Erik, you know, if you ever, and I quote, if that church thing doesn't work out and you ever need work again, you can always come back here. And I said, I appreciate it. I really do. But if there is one line of work that is guaranteed, if there is one industry that is just absolutely fail-proof, if there is one segment of our world that does not feel the ebb and flow of economic ups and downs, it is the church of Jesus Christ, because the very gates of hell will not stand against. I said, don't worry about me. And it felt so good to say, now, in 2 weeks, when I walk out, all I have to do is preach and teach and build up saints. And it was such a blessing. And here's Paul rejoicing in this now. These men came and they brought financial support to him. And now it says he was able to be occupied with the word. And the word is laid out there plainly, just in case you forgot what Paul preached. He was preaching to them that the Christ was Jesus. The Christ was Jesus. And you say, well, shouldn't that say Jesus is the Christ? Depends on how many liberties your translation took. In the Jewish belief, they believed in a Christ. They just didn't believe in Jesus. Now, we all understand that Christ is not just Jesus' last name, right? Christ, the Christos, the anointed one, the sent one of God, the Messiah, the hope of Israel. They believed in a Christ. They just didn't believe that Jesus fit the bill. And Paul would go in and reason with them and say that Christ that you're waiting for, he came. That sacrifice, that one who would come and take away the sins, it happened. The one who would conquer death, he did it. And now it befalls you to believe in him. And that's what he would preach. And he was so joyful to be able to dedicate himself to this. And so, verse 6 says, they opposed and they reviled him, the Jews did, as he tried to tell them about Jesus. And he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads, I am innocent, for now I will go to the Gentiles. And he left there and went to the house of a man named Tedious Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord. He and his whole house became believers in Jesus Christ. So Paul's preaching to them, and finally, they just get to that point where we're not going to believe you. We're going to oppose you. We don't want to believe that Jesus is the Christ. And Paul does something that meant a whole lot to the Jews. They understood this. Every time a Jew would leave the holy city of Jerusalem and go about to all these different places on travels for whatever reason, when he came back into the city, before he stepped through the gates of the city, he would take his outer garment and he would shake it. Symbolically saying is that if there is any residue from these pagan lands, if there's any uncleanness from out there, let it stay out there and not be carried with me into this holy place called Jerusalem. But Paul turned it on them inside the synagogue of the Jews, which was kind of an embassy of the holy temple to them. He turns and he shakes his garment and he says, here, lest any residue of your unbelief and of your legalism and of your dead, dry religion follow me into that place that God is going to establish in this city. He says, I'm done. He says, and I'm innocent. Your blood be on your own heads. Quoting the crowds that shouted out as the rulers said, why should I kill Jesus? And they said, just kill him. But we can't do this. It's not, let his blood be on our heads, they said. Let us own the fault for this. Again, something that gets lost on our modern mentalities. For him to say I'm innocent is not saying I'm sick of you. He's not saying I'm tired of you. Because being sick of people or tired of people or frustrated by people is not a reason to stop ministering to them. People being difficult is not just reason enough to stop. He was being led by the Spirit that it was time now to move to the Gentiles, which you remember when the Lord called Ananias to go and pray for him. He says, I'm going to use this guy to reach the Gentiles. He was just fulfilling his life's purpose. But he couldn't leave without the satisfaction of saying, I'm innocent. Innocent how? Marlene and I were just talking about this at the table. In the old days, and you heard the Lord say this to the prophets sometimes, that you're to be as a watchman on the wall. And since we don't have walled cities and we're not attacked by other warring cities all the time, we don't really understand this the same way. But there was a particular job of a particular soldier in those days where he would stand up on the wall of a walled city at night and he would just scan the landscape all night, never falling asleep, never being distracted, and just scan the horizon and see if there was any sign of any attacking armies, anyone coming with any degree of hostility to that city. He was to see it, and if he saw an army coming, it was his absolute duty to take up his horn and blow it loud and blow it clear and blow a particular call that would let the city know we are under attack. Things are serious. It's time now for you to react. And in times where maybe the enemy would come and the watchman on the wall would fall asleep or be distracted, the attack would come, and if they were able to somehow at the end of the day fend off the attack and get the opposing army out, the first question they would ask is, where was the watchman? And they would bring him and they would question him and they would interrogate him and say, where were you? Why did you not call? Why? We had no idea of what was coming. We were unaware of the impending doom. We had no chance to react. We had no notice given to us. And he was held especially responsible. But on that same token, if the watchman saw impending doom and he blew the trumpet and he blew it loud and he blew it strong and the people chose not to react, it was then on them. And after the battle was fought and they would call the watchman, and the question they would ask was, did you blow the trumpet? Did you blow it loud and did you blow it clear? And if he could answer in full confidence, absolutely, yes, sir, I did. I saw the impending doom. I saw what awaited these people if they didn't react, and I blew it loud and I blew it clear. Now it befalls them to react, and they chose not to. I am innocent. Their blood is on them. And it's no wonder that the Lord said that to the prophets, and it's no wonder that Paul was able to say those same things to these Jews. I am innocent. I have blown the trumpet. I have been clear. I have been loud. I have let you know of the impending doom for those who do not believe that Jesus Christ, is the only way to salvation. I am free of the blood of you all. I have blown the trumpet. Doesn't say he was joyous. That's not a happy day. But there is a certain amount of satisfaction in knowing I have not withheld from you the whole counsel of God. Later on, when we get to chapter 20, you're going to see Paul again speak in this similar fashion. I feel the confidence of knowing Now some of us are saying, I wish little Johnny would be saved and little Sally would come to Jesus and little Billy would stop doing that. And I wish my son, my daughter, my mom. Stop wishing. And start blowing the trumpet loud and clear. Otherwise, you will never have the satisfaction of knowing that they knew the gospel and chose not to react. They knew exactly who the Savior was, and it was their choices. And I've seen too many parents in hospital beds going to their graves saying, oh, what about Johnny, and what about Sally, and what about Billy, and what about preaching the gospel to them? Spend all your time wishing. What about your neighbor? What about your boss, your employee? Blow the trumpet, or you'll never be able to have the satisfaction of saying, I was faithful. It's the only thing that kept Paul sane after leaving Athens. Oh, I wish there would have been a huge explosion there. I wish the whole city would have turned to Jesus. But the only thing I have to latch onto is I blew the trumpet. I sounded the call. I let them know there is impending doom if you don't turn to Jesus in a very real way. Not as the unknown God, not as one God among many, but as the only hope of man. For there is no other salvation. There is no other name given among men whereby we must be saved. It's all and only Jesus. And once that is declared, there is a certain satisfaction that comes in knowing I have preached the gospel. And now it's upon the city people to react. He walks out. And he goes and he does just what he said. But it's interesting, he doesn't go underground. He doesn't go and try and pray. You see where he goes? Did you read that? He went next door. He finds this new believer, Tedious Justice. And he says, well, I'm looking for a new place to call my international headquarters for Pauline ministry here. And he sets up camp right next door to the synagogue. They're not trying to be low profile. He didn't leave there in cowardice. He didn't leave there in defeat. He didn't even leave there trying to not rock the boat. But they set up camp right next door. Furthermore, in all the tumult and the preaching and the shaking of garments and the blowing of the trumpet, the preaching of the gospel, all of this stuff happens, and the thing that the Jews probably least wanted to see happened. The ruler of the synagogue named Crispus says, I love Jesus and he's my Lord. What? You're the leader of us. You were the leader of the opposition. You were supposed to be right there leading the charge against this gospel that he's preaching. And now you're saying that Jesus Christ is Lord? That Jesus is the Christ? And he and his whole family turn, and you can imagine how that went over with the Jews. This man insults us and he walks out with our leader. Now right about here, and we're about ready to see what it is God mostly wanted to point out to Paul. But I just want to recap real quickly. Look at the goodness of God towards Paul. He gives him these new friends, Priscilla and Aquila. He gives him Timothy and Silas, his beloved friends. He sends good news from the work in Thessalonica. He sends them financial support from Macedonia, which shows that the Philippians love us. When you send money to someone, it's saying, I believe in what you're doing. I love you. I think you're a worthwhile cause. That moved him. And then, not to mention that the money helps him to now be able to dedicate himself to gospel work. All of these things we see that God gave him. But we also see that God did not give him a break. He did not give him a break. While he refreshed him, he remained relentless. But we see further tender mercies of God toward his ambassador. Look at verse 9. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. And he tells him, Paul, don't be afraid. Don't fear. Jesus would not say this unnecessarily. Don't start forging in your mind this picture of Paul, the fearless. Jesus would not come to him and the first words out of his mouth be, do not fear, if Paul was not fearful. And Paul himself admits it. When he writes back to Corinth a little later in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, you don't have to turn there, just listen. He says, and I, this is great Paul, the great Paul writing back to them, when I came to you, brothers, I did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech of wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. I came to you worn so thin, so emotionally, spiritually, physically tired. And when I looked at how horrible your city situation was, I trembled. I didn't come in the conquering hero. I came in fearful. I came in perplexed. I came in worn out, but I came in. This totally wicked place where he was alone. You can only take so many curses and beatings and be chased out of so many cities before you begin to take it personally. Now, you and I don't know this degree of persecution.
Unless I'm totally unaware of some martyrs among us. We don't know what it is to suffer to this degree, but nonetheless, we can suffer. We can go through some things. Like I mentioned, we've shared with folks and have them not respond or respond in hostility. We've tried to help a brother grow, to have him resent you for it. And notice the next words. He says, don't be afraid. I know you are, Paul. I know you're afraid. But go on speaking and do not be silent. Oh, I bet you Paul was almost tasting the next words. He was anticipating what those next words were going to be. Do not be afraid, Paul, for I will grant you a long hiatus. Take a 3-year sabbatical. Just rest. Forget this preaching thing for a moment. The problem is the preaching. The problem is gospel work. The problem is, no. Make no mistake, and I am sick, and I am tired, and I am declaring war on the garbage that is being circulated amongst Christendom that says that there is something inherent in ministry that is dangerous to you, your marriage, your health. Oh, no, don't get involved in ministry. That destroys marriages. No, you know what destroys marriages? Sin. Not the ministry. Oh, no, don't become a preacher because then life's going to be hard on you. And everything. No. You know what makes life hard if it's not by God's own providence? We make life hard on ourselves by pride and lust and greed. There is nothing in the ministry that is inherently dangerous. We got people saying, I would love to. I have had a couple, in all honesty, say, we have thought often about giving ourselves. Oh, our hearts just leap within us when we hear about gospel work and missionary work and evangelistic work and social justice and all these things. We want to do something, but no, because we were taught that Satan brings a special attack upon those who are involved in ministry. And I love my babies too much than to have them watch us go through that. I don't know who you heard that from, friend. But I know who you haven't been listening to. Because the same God who calls to ministry sustains in ministry. I've seen ministry couples, divorce. That wasn't the ministry that split them up. That was sin. Oh no, I've seen ministry children kicked to the curb and treated poorly. That's not because the ministry calls for us neglecting our children. That's sin. It's not the ministry that does that. It's not the gospel that destroys families. I had very well-intended people trying to tell me maybe some of the things that you've heard. Erik, man, think about it, bro. Think about it. Don't plant a church. No, man, don't be a pastor. No, don't be a preacher. I remember a phone call I got from a friend. He's still a friend of mine. I got the last laugh because he's in the ministry now, but I remember getting a phone call the week after I was ordained. And I saw on the caller ID who it was, and I said, hello, and the first words out of his mouth were, they got you, man. They got you. What about your college degree? What about your plans? They got you now. And I'm trying to think of some witty comeback. And all I could come up with was, you're right. But I can't think of anything else that deserves the rest of my life. The Lord didn't give him a break. This has to keep going. The gospel has to keep going forth. And one of the reasons he doesn't stop Paul is because Paul was at one of the best places he could ever be. And I pray that some of you can get there and you can taste that one day. When you get to that place in ministry where you're done, where you end, where you come to your absolute conclusion. You are spinning, dangling at the end of the rope. You have no more bright ideas, no more physical strength, no more anything. You're done, you're out, you have nothing. And then God uses you better than you've ever been used before. At times that I've come out of a pulpit and I've just had to crumble in my office or when I get home and say, what was that? I didn't pray enough. I didn't study enough. I'm not good enough. What was that? I remember sitting in a little hotel room in Argentina one time and I just couldn't stop weeping. What was that, Lord? That wasn't, I don't have that. And I remember the words of this same Paul that said, for when I am weak, then am I strong. For his strength is made perfect in my weakness. When I get out of the way, he shines the brightest. When I'm completely spent, where I end is where he begins. At a conference one time, a whole bunch of seasoned pastors and preachers are sitting up on the stage, and they gave an opportunity for a young recent seminary grad to come up and preach, and he was well versed in all of the ancient languages and had studied all the great church fathers, and when it was time for him to preach, he didn't walk up, he marched up to that podium, and he set his Bible on that lectern, and he smiled. And he smiled like a TV game show host. And he proceeded to open up his notes. And he just went ahead. And from there on, he just stumbled and tripped for the next half an hour. And made no sense to anyone and blessed exactly no one. And I could tell he wasn't even done when he just closed it. He walked away. And as he's walking, one of those seasoned preachers catches him by the coat and quotes what an earlier seasoned preacher had said to a similar situation. He said, young man, as he walked by with his head down and his feet dragging, he said, young man, if you would have walked up the way you walked down, you would have walked down the way you walked up. Having been used by God, having approached the work with humility, knowing that I have nothing to offer. And when I am spent, God can shine in big, beautiful ways. But the work must not stop. So God saves the greatest comfort of all for him in verse 10 when he just says, don't be afraid. Don't stop preaching. For I'm not sending an angel. I'm not sending any more buddies. I am with you. The greatest comfort of all. Because you can even get lonely in the middle of a crowd sometimes. He says, I am with you. Paul knew that. Paul knew that. Paul knew that. That was right there at the end of his charge when Jesus, as he's about to ascend, says, go and make disciples, baptizing all men in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and make disciples of them, teaching them to follow all the things that I commanded you. And before I leave, this is the last thing I got to say before I go up into a cloud. The last thing I need to say, because it's the thing you're going to need to remember. Let this be etched into your mind. And lo, I am with you even until the end of the age. And I might be preaching to about 2 people in this place today. But I'm hoping some of you can put this in your hip pocket as God calls you into, intense, ongoing, not recreational, not time and again, but into the ministry that he's prepared for you. That you'd be able to remember that and have that be enough. I'm with you. You don't have any money. You don't have all your health. You don't have all the resources you might think you need. You don't have all the help you think you need. You don't have an audience that is receptive to your message, but I am with you. That's enough to keep you going. He says, I'm with you even until the end of the age. And Paul later confesses it in his second letter to the Corinthians when he says, For God who said, let the light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. It's not us. We're mud cups. He's the glory. He's what the world needs. Not you, not the preacher, the preaching. Not the messenger, the message. And then he goes on to say, we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifest in our bodies. We operate on the edge. On the edge. Where we are closest fulfilling John the Baptist's cry, less of me, more of him. Less of me, more of him. Don't remember me, remember him. Don't walk out of here talking about the preacher. Don't walk out of here talking about the band. Walk out of here talking about the Savior. Walk out of here talking about the King of glory. Walk out of here talking about the hope of the world. Don't grow weary. Don't quit. Don't even take a break. I'm with you. And completely as an act of grace. He does for him what he does for Abraham. You remember that after he calls Abraham, Abraham believes and follows him. And he's about to go and he's about to pour out wrath on Sodom and Gomorrah. That the Lord says, seeing that Abraham is faithful and he's my own and that through him I will fabricate a nation. Should I keep from him the plans that I have? And he says, no. And he tells him, I'm about to wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm going to let you in on my plans. I'm going to let you know what I have in my heart. I've seen what's in your heart. But anyone so faithful to me in my cause, he says, I will reveal things to you. And so he calls Abraham and lets him in on the plan. And in here he does the same thing to Paul, just as an act of encouragement. And he says, first of all, no one will attack you to harm you. You know that pattern, Paul? Arrive, preach, beating, run. Not here. Not here. Don't stop preaching, though. But I'm not going to push you past this breaking point. As Isaiah writes, he will not break the bruised reed. And he will not snuff out the smoldering wick. That person that is just on the edge, barely hanging on. God is not so cruel as to snuff them out, as to break them where they're at their weakest point. But it doesn't mean you're going to stop preaching. It just means that I'm going to be careful with you. He says, they won't attack you to harm you. So crafty is he in his words. He didn't say they won't attack you. He said they won't attack you to harm you, because an attack comes in just a couple of verses. But he says, I'm going to protect you. And he goes on a step further. Didn't have to tell him this. But he says, for I have many in this city who are my people. What? I just got here. Have you looked out the window, Jesus? It's as dark as hell out there. These people are inventing new ways to sin against your holiness. And you have many people out there? And the Lord with full confidence says, I have many out there who are my people. They don't even know it yet. But they're mine. They don't even know it yet, but before the foundations of the world, I had already laid claim on them. They are mine, and I have sovereignly decreed that they will be mine. Hold on, don't worry about what it looks like. I'm telling you about what it will look like. And he reveals his strong sovereign arm to Paul so that Paul can know ultimately God will have the final word. You just remain faithful. I have many. He says it present tense. I have them. I have them in sin for the moment. I have them in darkness for the moment, but I have them. They're mine. Their names are written, not to be erased or blotted out. They are mine, and none will pluck them from my hand. It lets him in on his sovereignty. And you notice Paul doesn't get frustrated with this. Well, how am I supposed to, what do I do with that? You know who they are. You know who's going to be saved. Of what comfort is that to me? It's of great comfort when you just trust the Lord. It's just knowing that God is saving souls is enough. You remember Charles Spurgeon used to say when he was asked about this, people would ask him, hey, what do you do with this, man? This idea that God will save people, that he has determined in his sovereignty and his love and his grace, that he has elected those to be his own. What do you do with that? How do you keep on preaching if you don't even know if they're going to be saved or not? Spurgeon said, God has not told me who will be saved. I don't know. But he has told me to preach. And that I'll do. Because had God told me that he painted a yellow stripe along the back of those who would be saved, I would run around not preaching but lifting up shirt tails. But God's not told me. What he has told me is preach. Because I have many in this city. Many in Corinth. For Spurgeon, many in London. For us, many in Yuma that are his. Our call is to be the watchman on the wall, to let them know of the impending doom and the grace that is theirs if they were only here. And we must have the satisfaction when this is all done of being faithful and being able to stand and say, Lord, I proclaimed what I was called to proclaim. And all the while you were relentless and you were pushing me and you didn't let me stop, but nor did you let me break. Because God is relentless and he's also refreshing. And the Jews were not happy with him after 18 months of ministry. And it says that they brought him before the tribunal, saying this man is persuading people to worship contrary to the law. And yes, he was. Yes, he was. And they brought him before Gallio. And Paul, it says in verse 14, Paul was about to open his mouth. This may be my swan song. This sermon may end with the sound of stones hitting my cranium again. He's about to open his mouth and he's willing to preach again, willing to die, but he didn't even get a chance. Because just as he's about to speak, God sovereignly touches Gallio, and Gallio says, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crimes, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it's a matter of questions about your words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves, I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them out of the tribunal. God touches the heart of Gallio and makes him indifferent. He had every reason to get engaged in this. Don't misunderstand this. He says it was just a matter of Paul breaking the laws of the Jews, but Paul was in fact breaking the laws of the Romans as well. Because in order to preach Christianity, you had to be registered as a religio licito, a licit or a legal religion. You had to have their approval saying, and he didn't have that. But God touches Gallio's heart and says, you will not concern yourself with this. And makes him completely indifferent. Just like Proverbs 21:1 says, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hands of the Lord, and he turns it wherever he will. And then something weird happens, and I don't even know how to end this message. It says, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. What? Sosthenes is, now there's two ways this could end. And we don't know for sure historically without any shadow of a doubt. One of them is funny and the other one is glorious, so I like them both. Let me start with the funny one. One of them is that Sosthenes is leading the parade to the tribunal, dragging Paul behind. Come on, let's be done with this guy. Yeah, and they bring him before the tribunal and they stand before Gallio and they present their charges. And Gallio says, I don't care. And the guy who's leading the charge all of a sudden turns back at the mob and they say, we came ready to beat somebody. And they lean into Sosthenes and beat him. And Gallio watches it and says,
I still don't care. That one's funny. And I don't know, maybe it's wrong that I like it so much. But I like this one better. That Sosthenes was beaten because somewhere in the middle of all this, and I don't put it past Jesus, he reached out and he grabbed Sosthenes' heart and made him a believer. Because later when we read 1 Corinthians, we see Paul telling the believers, greet for me Sosthenes. Maybe Sosthenes was beaten because, mind you, remember who Sosthenes was. He's the successor to Crispus. Crispus was the leader of the synagogue. He got converted. Let's replace him with Sosthenes. And now Sosthenes gets converted by the folks next door. And Sosthenes may have been receiving the first of, I don't know, maybe many beatings. And Paul's watching this and saying in his heart, hold on. Hold on, brother. Hold on. Every one of those bruises, every lost tooth, every pint of blood shed for his name will not go unrewarded. Don't give up. Don't relent. At the end of it all, you will be refreshed. Because if I know one thing about God, says Paul, he's relentless, but he's refreshing. Paul learned this in phases, but it was made very clear on this day, and he preaches it from here on out, encourages us the rest of the way. Some of you, I hope, are moved just out of sheer curiosity, saying, what must it be like to be that given? To be that given to the work of the Lord. To be that, I mean, everything about me, my time, my gifts, my money, my home. Priscilla and Killa opened their home up. My blood, my health, my good name, for him. I'm not preaching recreational weekend warrior Christianity here. Everything. But know this. It's not seasonal. It doesn't come in different seasons of the year and break for the other part. It doesn't even come in seasons of life and break. You know, I love reading the stories of those faithful saints who were faithful to the last breath. Didn't buy into this worldly idea that once I hit 65, even Jesus doesn't respect anything. It doesn't expect anything from me. That after 65, the gospel can't demand anything from me. I answer to no boss after I retire. Oh, buddy. He's relentless.